Hayom harat olam. Hayom ya'amid b'mishpat kol yitzurei olam. We say this time after time in the Mussaf prayers. Today is the birthday of the world, or the birthday of man. Today, man, every creature on earth is judged. Did you ever ask yourself, what's the connection? What is it about the day of creation of man that connects it to the day of judgment of man? Why does one follow from the other? Another question, which is also very important, is that we know that this day is a holiday. We're supposed to celebrate. The Gemara learns this from two verses in Tehillim that basically say that this is a chag, a festival, and it's also a day of judgment. And if you weren't sure if we should be celebrating, it's the birthday celebration or it's the judgment celebration. So the Gemara makes it very clear that we're talking about celebrating judgment. And the Shulchan Aruch here says, Ochlim v'shotim usmechim, you eat and drink and be merry. And if you weren't sure exactly what that meant, so the Mishnah Berurah explains, Rotzelomar, Af shehu yom hadin, even though it is the day of judgment, so you would think there isn't going to be any celebrating. You have a mitzvah of rejoicing in the holiday. These are the same words that are used in our most happy holiday of Sukkot. We are supposed to rejoice like a regular holiday while we're being judged. How can that make any sense? And then to prove it, so the Mishnah Berurah brings a verse from Nehemiah, Achlu mashmanim ushtu mamtakim, eat good foods, drink good drinks, Ki kadosh hayom adonenu, because today is a sacred day for God. Va'al te'atzevu, don't be aggrieved. Ki chedvat Hashem hi ma'uzchem, because the joy of the Lord is your strength. What does that even mean? We'll try to get to that by the end. In order to try to answer these two questions, what is the connection between creation and judgment, and why are we celebrating this? We could answer by a very simple midrash that goes through the play-by-play of when Adam was created. It's a midrash in Vayikra Rabbah. It says that in the first hour, God thought about creating man. In the second, he pulled together the dust, etc., etc. In the 10th hour, sorry, the 9th hour, he commanded him. In the 10th hour, man blew it. In the 11th hour, God judged him. In the 12th hour, he was acquitted. And so God came to Adam and said, look, you are a good omen for your children, because just like today, you entered into judgment with me and were acquitted, so too will your children, basically all the world, will be acquitted on this day. So you could say, oh, that's the answer. The connection between creation, the day of creation of man, and the judgment is that that's what happened. Adam got created and got judged, and the joy is that he was acquitted, and so he's off the hook, we're off the hook. But all of that answer is really very historical. It's not intrinsic. It's like we celebrate Passover on the 15th of Nisan. Why do we do that? Because that's when the Jews left historically. But that's all kind of bidi avad. That's all sort of after the fact. I think that there is an intrinsic connection between the day of creation and the judgment of man. And in fact, that's what the poem says. Today is the day of creation. Today, all creations will be judged. It doesn't say, today is the day Adam was judged. Today is the day when everyone will be judged. No, there's a direct, intrinsic link between the creation of man and the judgment of man. What is it? So in order to answer that question, I want to share with you a little bit of philosophy from Jean-Paul Sartre. Jean-Paul Sartre is known as the great existentialist, a great atheist. And so you might say this is a bit unorthodox to bring one of the great secular thinkers of the world to try to explain one of the great holy, religious, believing holidays. So my answer to you is that sometimes you can appreciate what you have by looking at people who don't. So let's try to read through just a few sentences of Jean-Paul Sartre. The existentialist finds it extremely embarrassing that God does not exist, for there disappears with him all possibility of finding values in an intelligible heaven. There can no longer be any good a priori, since there is no infinite and perfect consciousness to think of it. It is nowhere written that the good, quote unquote, exists, that one must be honest or one must not lie, since we are now upon the plane where there are only men. Dostoevsky once wrote, if God did not exist, everything would be permitted. And that for existentialism is the starting point. Everything is indeed permitted if God does not exist, and man is in consequence forlorn. For he cannot find anything to depend upon, either when in or outside himself. So now, what I'd like to try to do is understand these 5 sentences a little bit better. First of all, he says the existentialist is extremely embarrassed that God does not exist. So first of all, what is an existentialist really? So existentialism, by definition, is existence before essence. What does that mean? Well, what it means is that normally, when somebody comes to make something, I want to make a table. So I think about it. What do I want from this table? Well, I need it to be a certain height. I need it to be a certain strength, a certain sturdiness. It needs to be able to be so that I can eat on it and it doesn't break down if I lean on it, et cetera, et cetera. I define the purpose and the function, and then I go about making it. So that is what we call essence before existence. I thought about the essence of this table, and now I went and made it and brought it into existence. That is what the philosophers call essentialism. Existentialism is exactly the opposite. First, you exist, you have no purpose, no one thought of any way or any reason for you to do anything, and you later come up with some kind of essence. Existence before essence. And so basically what he goes on to explain is he says like this: man, first of all, exists, encounters himself, surges up in the world, and defines himself afterwards. If man, as the existentialist sees him, is not definable, it is because to begin with, he is nothing. He will not be anything until later, and then he will be what he makes of himself. And here, I want to explain that everybody needs to make something of themselves. Even religious people that believe in God and a God-given purpose have to make something of themselves. They just have to make something of themselves within the framework of this divine purpose of creation. However, for Sartre, who doesn't believe that there's any God or any purpose, so that means that man has to make something of himself arbitrarily, from nothing. You just need to do something. And so this basically brings us to the point where he says that this is very embarrassing. The existentialist finds it extremely embarrassing that God does not exist, for there disappears with him, with God, all possibility of finding values in an intelligible heaven. So first of all, why is he embarrassed? Well, if somebody came up to me and said, so what do you do? And I said, well, I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? You're a grown man. You don't know what you're doing? You don't know what you're doing here? Well, I mean, I'm an engineer. I design autonomous vehicles. Why do you do that? Well, we could save lives. So what? Why are you saving anybody's life? Maybe it's better we all check out. We're here for nothing. We live in a vacuum. There's no point. It's very embarrassing if there's no purpose to creation, because we're here living in a vacuum. It's all a sham. But then he goes on to explain that there are no values. Why are there no values if there's no God? So he says there can no longer be any good a priori. Before anything, there can't be any definition of good, since there is no infinite and perfect consciousness to think of it. There's no God to think of any good. So basically what he's explaining here is that if I create something, I want to make a table. So now there's a definition of a good table and a bad table. The good table fulfills all the purposes that I made it for. It's sturdy, it doesn't fall down, it's at the right height, it's a good table. But if you don't make the table for any purpose, nobody made it, it just popped up. Let's say I decided I'll use this tree stump for a table, but it doesn't work and all my food rolls off and everything breaks. Well, I can't go to the table and say, to the tree stump and say, oh, what a lousy table. Who said it's a table? You said it's a table. He said it's a tree stump. You can't call it, you could call it a bad table, but it never was supposed to be a table. It's a tree stump. So the same thing, if man just popped into existence, if man arbitrarily just evolved from nothing, so he has no purpose, he has no definition of what's a good man and what's a bad man. We make it all up. There's no a priori good. There's no one that said intrinsically something is good or something is bad. We may come up with ideas. We may say, it's bad to kill people. Why is it bad? Well, if everybody goes around killing everybody, so we're not going to get along so well, our society is going to crumble. So let's not do that. That's instrumental. But it's not inherently bad. And in fact, if you look at secular philosophers today, all the corner cases of murder or killing are up for grabs. Suicide. Why is suicide bad? Is it intrinsically bad? People try to come up with reasons. Well, it's bad because, the people of the family that's left over there, it's hard for them. Euthanasia. Why is it bad? Well, people try to come up with instrumental ideas. Only a God, only the creator could tell you it's inherently bad. Don't do that. So there are no values. And that's why Sartre goes on and he says, it is nowhere written that the good exists, that one must be honest or one must not lie. Not written anywhere. If you think that it makes sense to lie, so maybe instrumentally that makes sense. Maybe not. Maybe if everybody goes around lying, so then the society again falls apart. So let's agree, like Hobbes said, that to the social contract, and let's not go around lying either. But it's not inherently, nowhere is it written that you shouldn't lie. So he goes on and he says, since we are now upon the plane where there are only men, only people, there's nobody outside of us to have thought about what kind of a person we want, what kind of a table we want. What is a good person? So he goes on and he explains, Dostoevsky once wrote, if God did not exist, everything would be permitted because there's no one to define good or evil. And so Sartre says, and that for existentialism is the starting point. He agrees, absolutely, everything is permitted. We, human beings, have to define what it is we want out of this random life that we've been thrown into. Everything, he goes on to say, is indeed permitted if God does not exist, and man is in consequence forlorn, lost. Man has no direction. Man has no purpose. Man has no definition. Forlorn. For he cannot find anything to depend on either within or outside of himself. You can look inside and say, what's good? But you can't really depend on that. You can look outside and listen to what other people have to say, but you can't really depend on that either because everybody's just coming up with stuff. Ultimately, Sartre explains that because of this godless world we live in, our lives are abandoned. We live in anguish, despair. In a word, our lives are absurd. So now we can begin to understand the connection between creation and judgment. You see, if we believe that we're created, this day is the day of creation. That means that we have a purpose. There is an infinite perfect consciousness that thought about us and said, I want this person to come to being. And he has a purpose. And therefore he has a definition of what's good and bad. And so now I can judge him. So that is the intrinsic connection. Hayom harat olam, hayom yamid mishpat. Because today is the day of creation, there can be a definition of good and bad. There can be an evaluation of how good or bad you're doing. There can be a judgment. And not only that, that is in fact the essence of the joy of this day. Today is a great holiday. Why is it a great holiday? This holiday is probably even more rejoiceful than Sukkot, because this is the day that we celebrate that there is a purpose, that we're not forlorn, that we don't live our life in anguish, that we do have something to rely on as to what is right and what is wrong. We have a purpose. And so at the end of the day, when we read the Mishnah Brura, who explains to us that we are supposed to v'samachta v'chagecha, and he brings the words of Nehemiah, ichlu mashmanim uvshtu mamtakim, eat and drink good food, ki kadosh hayom ladoneni, because today is a holy day, it's a sacred day, this is an amazing day to God. He created us for a purpose. Al te'atzevu, don't be grievous, ki chedvat Hashem hi ma'uzchem, because the joy of God is your strength. What is that supposed to mean? The joy of God is your strength. So there's many ways to read it. The way I read it, as we've just explained, is that our rejoicing in the fact that there's a creator who made us for a purpose, who gave us a definition of right and wrong, values to live our lives by, that in fact is our strength. We are to rejoice today. We become strong through that rejoicing because now we strengthen ourselves for a purpose and a fulfillment of that purpose in our lives. And so I would only conclude with the words of Nehemiah and say to you, Muchlu mashmanim ushtu mamtakim ki kadosh hayom ladonenu al te'atzevu ki chedvat Hashem hi ma'uzchem. Go eat good food, drink good drinks, because today is a holy day for God. Don't be sad. Rejoice in God, because He is your strength. Shana tova, ketiva tova, chatima tova.